Go.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday to join me. Um, I'm Lindsay. I teach for the Masters of Instructional Design and Technology program, and I get to do awesome webinars like this. I'm so happy to be joining you all. If you have questions at any time, I do tend to talk really fast, so you are welcome to unmute yourselves and ask your question, or I have the chat window open and actually a couple screens here to make sure I can catch all of your questions as they arise. So anytime, please jump in with any questions or comments, please. I love to hear from everyone that's attending webinars as well, because sometimes I just feel like I'm shouting into a void sometimes. So please, I welcome any and all interactivity. So let's go ahead and jump in to humanizing online learning. Here's what we'll cover today. I want to talk about social aspects of learning, including universal design for learning and accessibility. So this is basically going to be a three-parter presentation where I talk about why it's important to have social aspects in your learning experience. We'll talk about principles of universal design for learning, and we'll talk about building in accessibility to your online learning experiences. So my goal is to build learning for humans, basically, and there's a lot of different aspects to being human that might shape the way that you construct an online learning experience, as I like to call them. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. Come on, computer. Here we go. All right, so I'd like to kick this off with talking about the 7 principles for good practice. There is this wonderful article published in 1987 titled 7 Principles for Good Practice in Undergraduate Education. I'm fully aware this is a K-12 focused webinar, P-12 I should say, but the 7 principles will really serve you well across basically any learning experience. They've definitely stood the test of time, and not just for undergraduates. Here are the 7 principles. The first one is that the instructor should encourage contact between students and faculty, develop reciprocity and cooperation among students, encourage active learning, give prompt feedback, time on task, communicate high expectations, and respect diverse talents and ways of learning. Now, any seasoned educator is already doing pretty much all of these things, but I want to talk a little bit more in depth about a couple in particular. Come on, PowerPoint. Uh-oh, my PowerPoint's frozen. Come on, buddy. Here we go. Oops. Okay. Let me reload that. Okay, so today in particular, I'm going to touch on the ones that are bolded here, 3 out of the 7. I want to talk about contact between students and faculty, and then basically contact between students with reciprocity and cooperation. That's going to be part of social aspect of learning. And by touching on universal design for learning, we will touch on number 7 there, the respects diverse talents and ways of learning. So let's dive into the first topic here, social aspects of learning. Oh, I had a poll set up. Let me pull that up really quick. So get ready to respond using your mobile device or your browser. Let me get that loaded really quick here. My presentations. Here we go. So I'm going to pull that up and present. Nope. Let's put that over here. Okay, so on your screen there, go to, let me make this bigger, menti.com, METI.com, and enter this code. I'd like to hear your thoughts. And I've got 2 questions for you. This is the first one, and I have one more after that. So you head on over to METI.com and use the code 671199. And you'll be transported into our poll for this session. This is a free tool. I'll just go ahead and tell you a little bit about it while you get set up. It's a free tool. There's a free version and a paid version. I use the free version for webinars and other class situations. And what's neat about it is that as people answer the poll, your answers will actually appear on screen. So it's a really nice live way to get some attendee interaction. I'll give you a couple minutes to dive into that. My goal with this is to kind of get a feel for how you all like to experience learning. Find out if you like discussing topics that you're learning about, asking instructor questions. Maybe don't ask the instructor questions. Kind of curious to see how you all approach this. Perfect. Okay. See a couple of responses there. I like discussing the topic. I usually ask instructor questions. Give about another minute to respond to that, and we'll move on to the next question. Okay. Let's see here. Is this going to let me go straight there? Is it going to make me bounce back and forward? Let's find out. It's going to make me, oops. Perfect. All right. So three like discussing the topic. One likes to ask the instructor questions. I noticed that no one answered, I don't like discussing the topic, and I don't usually ask the instructor questions. Why is this thing being a pain? Okay, here we go. So I have this poll to kind of highlight, as attendees, you enjoy being able to discuss things with other people. If you like discussing the topic, you like having a social aspect to your learning. If you ask the instructor questions, you like having that social aspect to your learning as well. It's pretty rare to have a solo learning experience where you're just watching a video or doing a course by yourself and really enjoying it as much as when you have an opportunity to discuss it with others that are also interested in the same topic. So let me put up the next one. Usually has a little arrow for me to go through these. All right, so in your browser on your mobile device, you should have been bounced to the next question. What is a challenge that you've experienced as an online learner? This is a free text opportunity to respond and tell me about some of the challenges that you've had. And hopefully I'll be able to touch on some of those today as we talk about humanizing online learning. And this could be any sort of challenge. And the online learning experience doesn't have to be a formal learning experience. Maybe you're just trying to learn a new skill. You're trying to answer a question. If you have done courses or something more formal, I'd like to hear especially about those experiences, but any sort of online challenge you've had with learning, I'd love to hear about it. Oh yes, having a meaningful, sustained conversation online. Yeah, that is a big challenge. Yeah, as an online instructor, we run a lot of discussion forums, but it's difficult to replicate the in-person experience because you're missing out on body language and kind of the chemistry you get in a classroom when you kind of meet a kindred spirit and you can bounce ideas off each other. Yeah, time is definitely a huge challenge as an online learner as well. Being able to practice. Right. In the seven principles, we talk about prompt feedback, and I emphasize often that feedback is critical to the learning process. Learners need to be able to practice something. They need to get feedback on it. There's different ways to give feedback, of course. It doesn't all have to be on the instructor, but it's really important to be able to practice something to make sure you got it. Basically, to make sure that you're learning something successfully rather than just being thrown right to some final assessment that can be kind of stressful. All right. Thanks for chiming in with those. I'm going to exit out of this. Move it off my screen over here. Okay, so thank you for participating with that. Jump back to the PowerPoint here. All right, so let's talk about the importance of social interaction. So the responses to the first question were that you like discussing topics, you like being able to ask questions. I mean, who doesn't, right? And this plays to not only enjoying a social aspect to learning, but also really appreciating a feedback process. Even if you're just discussing something with a peer, you will get some sort of feedback from that. If you're able to discuss with the instructor, you're especially going to get feedback, hopefully. So it's really a nice part of the learning process when you can have those social interactions just to be able to get that feedback. Additionally, social interaction will support active learning rather than just watching a video, maybe quietly reflecting by yourself. That's a very passive experience. So when you have some sort of social aspect built in, it's going to support active learning. It's going to improve learner motivation. I am much more motivated to attend live events and webinars rather than seek things out on YouTube. I mean, there's tons of content on YouTube, on LinkedIn Learning, lots of articles to read, but if it's not a live event involving other people, I'm less likely to pursue those opportunities. I imagine it's probably the same for a lot of you as well. I'm more motivated to attend social learning opportunities, and I'm also more motivated to participate when there's some sort of social experience in that learning opportunity as well. Really critically, social interaction will humanize a course. I keep going back to the example of some sort of asynchronous learning where you're just kind of there by yourself trying to learn something, and it can feel incredibly isolating and lonely. And it's just you and whatever asynchronous computer experience. It's not really a human experience, just a very, very dull passive experience. So when you do incorporate social interaction, you're going to hit a couple of other, how do you say, you're going to get a couple other benefits as well. There's a concept called high impact practices in undergraduate education. And I was really interested to see when I went through the high impact practices that most of them, or almost most of them, touched on some sort of social learning experience. So high impact practices are 11 practices that studies show lead to greater student retention and graduation in undergraduate education. I'm sorry, I tend to have a little bit of a higher education focus since I teach in higher education. But these are things that, of course, would apply to K through 12 potentially as well. Seminars, common intellectual experiences, learning communities, these are practices that would also be effective in a K through 12 experience, particularly for older students. But 4 out of 11 practices relate in some way to a social learning experience, which I thought was really interesting. So when you have some sort of social experience in a educational setting, students are more likely to be retained and to graduate. So that's really significant. If you use any sort of major assessment instrument like Quality Matters, this is a course review tool used in higher education. I was interested to see that there's a social aspects required by that as well, engaging with the content, instructor, and other students. And again, having that social interaction in a class is not only basically required to be a 4-credit class, right, by the Department of Education, it's going to lead to a more effective learning experience rather than just, you're never just going to throw someone into a lonely YouTube existence and expect them to be successful. That's just never going to happen. All right, but of course there are big challenges in online learning. It's easy to feel isolated and unmotivated, even in a, multi-week online class like we teach in our instructional design program. Learners, it's on them to log in and to participate. And oftentimes, if they aren't proactive, it is very easy to feel isolated and unmotivated. So as an instructor, it's my goal to make sure that there's humanizing touches into my courses to make students feel more connected so that they're more likely to log in and to participate. Online learning experiences, again, lonely, isolating. They can also be difficult for learners to navigate. And when you are by yourself at your computer, I mean, you may not even be able to ask for help because you're having so much trouble navigating a course. So that can be a big challenge. As an instructor, it's more difficult in online learning to see if learners are getting it. I've had a lot of in-person instructors say, no, it's hard in person too, because they'll tell you, or they'll tell you that they're getting it and they're really not. I still think it's harder online to tell if learners are getting it because, again, the onus is on them to respond, to complete assignments that show that they're getting it or not. So it is a big challenge. However, my thesis today is that humanizing your learning can help alleviate some of these challenges and set your students up for greater success. Okay. So what is humanized learning? Humanized learning is going to increase the relevance of your content and improve your students' motivation to log in week after week, especially in this pandemic. I mean, the incredibly sudden and terrible shift to online learning. I'm sure you've all experienced that if you did Zoom webinars or had some sort of online content, your students were probably unmotivated to log in. They might have dropped off. You may not even know what happened to them. And that's, you know, a cataclysmic event that's basically happened. But in future courses, hopefully hopefully you get a hold of your students, they're more likely to log in. Humanizing your future content will help students feel more motivated and make them better able to log in and be successful. It's kind of a long point here. But I thought it was really significant that when students relate to an online instructor as something more than just a subject matter expert, and when they begin to conceive of themselves as part of a larger community, they're more likely to be motivated, satisfied, and succeed in achieving the course objectives. So beyond just, you know, having an opportunity to be social and do some active learning, when they see their online instructor as something more than just someone that knows a lot about the subject that they're studying, and when they see their classmates as not just classmates, but a community of learning, they're more likely to be really motivated and satisfied with their learning experience and to be successful in the course. So I thought this was a really significant finding to share with you. Okay, so how do you humanize your learning? We'll go into a little bit more detail here. There's a few ways to do it. First off, with facilitation, it can be really helpful to establish a greater instructor presence. And this is also something that's gone in, if you go use a assessment instrument like Quality Matters to assess your online course, they actually have little points in the syllabus or the rubric, rubric for this assessment tool that goes into detail on how to really humanize your presence. But anyways, one of them is by doing welcome videos. So when I teach online, I make sure to have a video, like a little section in my course that says start here, because we do multi-week semester-long courses. And I do a self-introduction video where I actually record myself like I'm talking to the camera, so it feels a little personal. I talk about who I am, maybe what my educational philosophy is, maybe what I do outside of the classroom. So I'm kind of establishing myself as a person that's more than just a subject matter expert. Another way to establish presence is to give feedback by audio or video. One of the biggest challenge is in online learning is it's very text heavy, because when it comes to accessibility issues, it's usually pretty easy to provide text. It's harder to provide feedback by audio video, but there's no tone in email. There's no tone in texting. And it can be difficult for a student to feel comfortable with receiving critical feedback when they can't read the tone of whatever feedback they're receiving because it's just in text. So it can be really helpful if you do feedback by audio or video, because they've already kind of, you know, watched your welcome video, they see that you're a person, and they're able to hear the tone in your voice or see the tone on your face, you know, kind of see that emotion, see that when you give critical feedback, you're delivering it with kindness and with love and with interest in helping develop them as a learner. So that's another way to be able to humanize your presence and also soften critical feedback online. As an instructor, it's wonderful for your students to feel empathy from you. And when it comes to delivering empathy online, it has to be really intentional. And when you first, if you're new to online learning, it can feel fake, it can feel inauthentic to do these things, because you do have to be really intentional. To be approachable, you have to be proactive in being approachable. You can be approachable by making that welcome video. You can be approachable by sending occasional check-in emails to your students, or maybe even setting up phone calls or Zoom chats with them. It's important to check in with your learners and emphasize over and over again that you're available to help them out. This is something I try to do in my own educational practice. I try to emphasize I'm available through office hours. If you can't make that, you know, give me a call. Here's my phone number. We can set up an appointment at another time. But you kind of have to emphasize it again and again, because again, online learning can be big and lonely, isolating. It can be difficult to navigate. So it's really helpful to kind of reach out to your learners and not wait for them to find the information themselves, but to kind of push what's really important out to your learners. As an instructor, you can humanize your learning by surveying learners, doing icebreakers, help them build community, help them understand that you're trying to tailor this learning experience to them, that you're interested in what they have to say and what they have to think. Rather than just pushing content at them, you're making sure it's the right content for them and that they're, you know, invested in it as well. And you can also tell them what the survey results were, kind of show that you're trying to make a learning experience that's going to respond to what they think about the course. Come on, human. There we go. All right, so that's for facilitation. So as an instructor, those are some tips for humanizing your learning. As far as the actual online learning experience yourself, I use a catch-all term, learning experience, to kind of refer to any learning experience, any course, um, any Zoom webinar. I know that you're teaching in a variety of formats, and you might think of a learning experience as like a semester-long course. You also might think of it as like, this hour that we have together, and you also might think of it as a module you have in your course where your students are navigating through it on your own. Whatever it is, that's why I just use the catch-all term, learning experience. When you do design your learning experiences, there's a few features that I'd recommend that you include. The first one is choice. It's wonderful if you're able to give your students a few different ways to express what they're learning, and that's also an element in universal design for learning, which we'll talk about in just a moment. It's really helpful to challenge your students to see that they're individuals, and to, again, set those high expectations like is listed in the 7 principles for good practice. Challenge your learners, encourage them to try new things. Give your learners control where you're able to, and of course it's going to depend on the maturity of your students, maybe their age, their experience, as far as education goes. You might allow them to choose groups or suggest ideas to maybe to help them, encourage them to be a partner in their own learning. You can also build in collaboration. That's, again, the social aspect where learners learn with and from each other. PowerPoint's having some issues. Okay. So I read this, I found this really neat infographic online. I'll give you my slides at the end here, so if you want the source for this, you can go ahead and find it. I thought it was worth taking a screenshot from this infographic. This is from Humanizing Your Learning by Michelle Pacansky-Brock. When you are searching for anything about online learning, her name tends to pop up, and I really liked this infographic that she shared. So as educators, you're probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. This is the cognitive levels of learning. Starts at the bottom with remembering, goes all the way up through creating. But I really liked that she said cognitive is important, of course. This is where we're kind of doing the what of learning and maybe how they're going to learn it. But equally important is effective learning. Effective learning is kind of where we start treating our students as people. And these are the various levels of that. They're receiving it, they're responding to it, they're valuing it. I mean, this is often our goal as educators, right? We want them to be able to remember and understand things, but we also oftentimes want them to value this information, to organize it, to internalize it. Depending on what the topic is, we want them to do more than just do rote learning. We want them to, change as a person oftentimes and become a better person as a result of what they're teaching them. And also like that these 2 pyramids here are kind of also emphasizing that if you don't, treat them as humans, build learning experience for them as humans, a human teaching humans, they're not going to learn as effectively as they would otherwise. So all that said, if you'd please check in with me using the chat box, or you're welcome to unmute yourselves and share your thoughts. How are you all feeling right now? Does this feel like something that's useful to you as an instructor? Is there something else you want to get out of this webinar? Do you feel like this is something you can apply in your own instruction? You're welcome to unmute or use the chat box. I'll pause for a couple minutes while you do that. Assessment can be vague at this time. Yeah, I'm not touching so much on, I won't talk too much about assessment today. Yeah, it can be vague at this time. I'm kind of, when I approach a learning experience, I kind of just want to approach hitting some different features in that learning experience design that kind of embraces my students as people, and then kind of think about, assessment. When you're talking about assessment, it's more like the cognitive learning stuff. So I'm talking more about effective learning today, or techniques for humanizing your online learning. But if you have more specific questions, please drop them in the box and we'll talk about it. All right, how are the rest of you feeling? Andre, you feeling good? Thank you. Give you another minute to process. I always want to take some pauses in my webinars and kind of check in with all of you and make sure you're doing okay. Is this something useful for you? Make sure your questions are answered, and you also have a moment to pause and reflect or process and take a break from me chatting. Okay, so we'll move on. If you have more thoughts, please pop them in the chat box. Okay, so we talked just a moment ago about choice and control. Out of these items, the bolded ones are universal design for learning principles, both choice and control. So allowing learners multiple options for practice or assessment, and allowing learners to choose groups, suggest ideas, and have other forms of control in a learning experience. These are both universal design for learning principles, which brings us to the next segment of our presentation. Excuse me. Universal design for learning. Okay. So as educators, I'm sure you're very familiar with how people learn. Learning experiences are often shaped by individual preferences. So again, maybe someone wants to read rather than watch a video. But disabilities can also obviously be very big. What's the word? I don't know. I'm losing words these days. If someone has a disability, they're going to have different experiences when they're learning versus someone that doesn't have a disability. It can really impact what and how they're learning. Method of instruction, of course, should always depend on what is being taught. And that brings us, again, universal design for learning. The problem in general education is oftentimes there's a learning experience can be inflexible. It can be one size fits all. It's just one course is set up and it's all that's available for your learners, right? It's one way to do things, one option to complete all the things, to experience it. And it's assuming that all students are going to be able to learn in the same way. However, there is no such thing as an average learner. I'm sure you're aware of this as educators. So if you use universal design for learning, you're going to set up an experience that's going to fit basically every learner and allow them to learn in the way they learn best, and that's by using a variety of methods, materials, and assessments, and by giving learners choices. So to go a little bit deeper in that, when you start from the very beginning of the design stage, employing universal design for learning principles, you're going to provide a very good experience for the most learners possible. You're not just doing a one-size-fits-all experience that fits some mythical average learner that doesn't exist. And you're also going to start to meet accessibility requirements as well. Okay. So here's kind of the quick science breakdown of universal design for learning. Oh, I see you have a question in the chat. Huang, let me think about your question and circle back to it in just a second. Okay, so universal design for learning is trying to hit these three networks that your students have. They always want to know why they're learning something. There's the actual subject at hand that they're learning, and then there's the how of learning. And universal design for learning principles, when they are followed, they're going to help you hit all three things for your students, right? Yeah, your learners need to be motivated. They want to know why they're learning something. They need to know what exactly they're learning. And there's going to be different ways for them to learn that. So universal design is going to help you kind of hit each of those things. Right, so the why of learning, you're aiming to engage your learners. You want to stimulate interest and motivation for learning. The what is the representation. It gets a little into the nitty gritty. If you want to learn more, I've got some resources I can always share with you. It's helpful to present information and content in different ways for your learners. And then the how of learning is the action and expression category. It's really important to differentiate the ways that students can express what they know. So that's the practice and the assessment. So the goal is to provide multiple means for learners to use each of these networks. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So Huang, hopefully this will start to answer your question. I don't have a generic rubric to share with you, but I'll give some examples that'll hopefully help a little bit. And then any further questions you have, please share them in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, so when it comes to content when you use universal design for learning, it's helpful for your students to provide the same content in a variety of formats. Learners will choose how they will experience the content. An example would be you could do a recorded lecture, and the recorded lecture would include a video with captions, or it might be, actually should be an and or, it should include a transcript, If you had just some topic you're teaching in an online format and you didn't have a recorded lecture, you could ask your students to to watch a video, or maybe they'd have the option to read an essay, or maybe they'd listen to a podcast episode. So this is where it becomes really important in the design experience to have really set learning objectives in the very start, so that as you start to choose content that supports the learning experience, you're able to choose a variety of content that meets and supports those learning objectives while also giving your students choice. And when you are kind of designing according to the universal design for learning principles, it can feel like a lot. But if you're going to teach something, several times in the future, you might just start thinking about these things the first time you teach something, and then every time you teach this content in the future, you might add something else, maybe swap something else, kind of beef it up as you go along. So don't feel like you have to do everything from the start. You can begin just by keeping this in mind, maybe adding 1 or 2 options for content, and in the future you can always find and add more options for content. So again, we're starting to meet accessibility requirements here as well. Your video should always have captions, so your students don't just have to listen, they can also read along or read instead of listening. If you're using YouTube, YouTube will automatically generate a transcript if a video has captions, so that's another option for your students as well. Pre-pandemic, a lot of people had commutes, so a lot of students like to be able to, I teach adult students, they could listen to a podcast episode on their commute, but maybe your students would enjoy that as well, taking a walk, listening to a podcast, or maybe watching a video, reading an essay. It's really nice just to be able to give them a choice. And they don't have to be exactly equivalent, they all just have to meet your learning objectives. My PowerPoint's being a little fussy today. Come on, PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. So as long as your content, again, is well aligned to your learning objectives, it doesn't matter, theoretically, it shouldn't matter which format your learners choose, right? Whether it's a podcast or a video or an essay, if it's all well aligned, your students have a choice and they're happy to have that choice and they feel like they have a little bit more control and ownership over their learning process. So when it comes to practice or assessment, under universal design, you would offer several options for your learners to practice or assess their knowledge. An example would be if you had an online class discussion with a prompt, they could be given an option of how to respond to that prompt and how to participate in the class discussion. Maybe the first option would be they could just write 2 paragraphs. So again, we always kind of default to the text in online learning. So maybe the first option would be to write 2 paragraphs. Maybe they'd also have an option to record a video of themselves responding to the prompt. Or maybe they'd have an option to create and record a short presentation. I find when I offer this a variety of options to my students, there's a substantial chunk that still responds via text just by writing, because that's kind of the default. But some students really do like being able to record a video of themselves responding. And that also, again, humanizes your course, because their classmates get to see and enjoy them as a person. As an instructor, you get to see your students, which is really nice. And some students really like making a short presentation, and that's more power to them. Let's see, if you had a different format, maybe if you're doing a webinar, it's great if you can vary the formats for active learning. So in this webinar already, we've done a poll. We did a really brief discussion asking for your feedback. Depending on how much time you have in your webinar, or maybe how comfortable your students or learners are with the webinar format, you can also do breakout rooms. I've done quizzes using Kahoot that can work for a variety of audiences, all the way from small kids up to adults. All right, so that's a few options for building in the practice and assessment. So Huang, back to your question, I don't really have a generic rubric necessarily. I mean, ideally, a well-designed class is going to start with really good learning objectives. You're going to have a good idea of what the assessment is, but you're kind of just letting your learners choose how they want to get there. All the content and all the practice is going to be aligned to your learning objectives. So all your learners are still going to end up at the same place. So if you just have 1 or 2 things they could do for the final assessment. So theoretically, you wouldn't really have to do different rubrics. You're still going to measure that they got there based on the original learning objectives that you had. They just kind of get to, have a little bit more control over the process. Okay, so to kind of wrap up my UDL discussion, this is definitely the Cliff Notes version of Universal Design for Learning. If you want more, I'll give you my slides and it has some links in it. And I can also provide you more links as well if you'd like to email me. I'll make sure you have my email address at the end here. When you do start designing from the very beginning with using the UDL principles, you are closer to meeting accessibility requirements as well. So that brings us to our final topic, accessibility. So I'll go ahead and pause here for a moment. Are there any other questions or comments before I move on? No? Okay, thank you, Andre. Again, I like to pause periodically because I know I talk fast and I can cover things kind of quickly. Okay. Let's move on here. Okay. So universal design for learning is the bigger picture when you are designing a learning experience. That's kind of like, you know, thinking about how you're going to teach something, how your students will experience it. And accessibility is more about paying attention to the technical aspects of your learning material format. So we'll talk about how to technically improve the accessibility of your courses. And of course, accessibility is really important because not only are your learners pretty unique people, but 1 in 4 Americans has a disability according to the CDC, and accessibility features are handy for everyone. So if you would please, actually you can raise your hand. You can find the raise hand button in your Zoom experience. It's usually at the bottom of your screen under reactions or raise hand. I'm not sure, actually I think it might be the Zoom webinar format that you can raise a hand. Anyways, you're welcome to use a reaction, a happy face, or a thumbs up or whatever, or just pop something into the chat box if you want to participate. So respond in the way of your choosing if you have ever enlarged text on a website. If you've ever gone to a website on your phone or your computer and enlarged the text, go ahead and respond in the chat box or by using a reaction. Thank you, Sophia. Yep, I see your raised hand there. Very nice, thank you. Yeah, I've certainly enlarged text on a website. I do it probably at least once a day. All right, go ahead and put your hands down. Next one, respond if you've ever turned on closed captions on a video. Maybe YouTube or a movie on Netflix. Yes, Cynthia has. Yeah, I'm a big fan of captions these days. Thank you, Audrey. Yes, you found the thumbs up. Yep. Oh, I didn't pull this up on screen. Sorry, there it is. Turn on closed captions on video. And then number 3, raise your hand or respond if you've ever used dictation to type or text. Maybe on your computer, maybe on your phone. All the time, yeah. Yeah, me too. All right, Mr. Limmer has. I'm a big fan of dictation because phones can have tiny little keyboards, and sometimes I've only got one hand free or no hands free to be able to construct a message, so I've used that a lot. Whether you have or haven't used these tools, these are all assistive technology tools, and it's likely that 1 out of 4 of you has a disability, so maybe rely on specific assistive technology tools, but otherwise, these sorts of features and technology tools will basically benefit everybody. Whether you have a disability or not, there's always going to be a situation where there's something you need a different feature to help you accomplish, whether it's dictation or maybe whether you need to use closed captions because you're in an environment where you need to be quiet. Maybe you need to enlarge text because, you know, either if you got your reading glasses or the website is poorly designed and has tiny text and you need to enlarge it on your phone, or maybe if you're using it on your phone in the first place, it's just too small to use on your phone, whereas it might look fine on a computer, so you have to enlarge that text. These are things that are all designed for people with disabilities to be able to better use the web, but they do benefit everybody. So let's quickly cover accessibility and the law. I imagine that you're old, Cynthia, you're getting old and hard to see the text. Yeah, I use reading and computer glasses when I work, so it's great when I can make the font look how I would like it to. Imagine you're old and I imagine that you are all in P through 12 public institutions, but maybe you're in a private institution. I don't know. I teach students that work in a variety of industries, both public and private. So I was interested to learn back when I first got into accessibility, that legally, if you work in a privately funded organization, this is not like education, this is like you work at like a technology company or something, and maybe you're teaching or doing training in that company, you're probably not required to make your content accessible, which I thought was really interesting because, I mean, again, 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. 1 in 4 employees at any given company is probably going to have a disability. If you work for any sort of publicly funded agency, legally, you're almost definitely required to make your content accessible. But my little asterisk here, I'm not a lawyer, so please always check with your leadership for accessibility requirements in your organization. Okay, so here's what the law requires. Under the law, there are 4 principles. I just want to give you, go over these really quick as kind of the context for what you need to provide as far as accessibility. Any given experience needs to be perceivable. That means that, for instance, you're putting alternate text onto an image. So if someone's using a screen reader, they can still experience the image by the description rather than being able to see it. Or maybe your online experience can be presented in a different way. Maybe they can reshape it. Maybe they can scan it using a screen reader. Next is operable. They shouldn't have to use a mouse to experience whatever the learning item is. They should be able to use a keyboard as well, or maybe there's just multiple ways to navigate a given learning experience. I really like this one, understandable. Make text content readable and understandable, so that can actually be making simplifying your language. Again, I work in higher education, and we have a lot of very smart people that write some very dense verbiage in their scholarly articles. Those would not fly under accessibility or UDL oftentimes, unless it's just for other people in the field. It's really beneficial to learners and anyone with a disability, maybe a cognitive disability, if you can make your language understandable by a wider audience. Understandable also refers to helping your users avoid mistakes. So that might be that your learning experience has undergone some sort of usability testing where you just make sure that learners are able to get through it in a simple way and actually be able to get the full learning experience, not get stuck because they made some sort of mistake while interacting with the content. And last, any learning experience should be usable with an assistive technology. Now, you're probably all using whatever platform your school has given you. If you're using that, you don't really have to worry too much about being usable with assistive technology because any school is going to make those evaluations in advance when they select the technology for delivering your learning. But usually there are a couple little features like, the alt text or other items that you might have to turn on or make sure you're taking advantage of when you're creating the content to make sure that it does work with like screen readers and other sorts of technologies. Okay, here's my silly GIF. What does all of this mean? So those are the 4 principles. That's kind of the context for starting to make your experiences accessible. And I'll give you a few very specific pointers on how to do that. And if you have further questions about maybe your own content, you're welcome to share those with me. So the first is alt text for images. If you're using your learning management system or any sort of Microsoft product, you have the ability to add alternate text to images. That's going to be just a really short description. It's usually, the guideline is 140 characters or less, and that just makes it possible for people using screen readers to experience your images as well. If you're using an infographic, it should have all the text typed out below the infographic, not just as alt text because it's just too overwhelming for the alt text. So your alt text could actually be something like, the text is located below, and that screen reader user would know to go below to find that text. And it really should be short and sweet. If an image is decorative, do not add alt text because if someone's using a screen reader, they probably don't care that you have some decorative element on your screen. They don't really want to hear about it. Make it simpler for them. Don't add alt text and they can just go to the next item instead. All right, when it comes to visual design, considering your contrast is very important. You need to have sufficient contrast to make text readable. The legal standard is 5.1 to 1 ratio at a minimum. Sorry, that's a typo there. It should be ratio and not ration. I thought I had fixed that. There's tools online to help you with this. But in general, just consider, kind of like, black and white. Don't use hard to see shades of gray. If you have an image and you're putting text over it, make sure it really pops. I was surprised to see this particular example of an Amazon Music ad that this white text here is actually not, it does not have enough contrast against that blue background. It looks to me as someone that's, you know, pretty well sighted that this does, but according to legal standard, it does not. So there are tools online that help you choose different colors to make sure that it does have a sufficient contrast for readability. All right. Closed captions are an important element of accessibility. I recommend highly adding closed captions to all videos. And of course, it's going to depend on the privacy and educational privacy requirements of your own specific institution. My strategy is to use YouTube. I'll do upload a private video, for instance. You can upload a video and YouTube will produce closed captions automatically based on the sound of that video for the speech anyways. And then after a few minutes, those will populate and go in and correct the automatic captions. If you do have a transcript, like you've read a script and you've recorded your own video, you can upload that video and your transcript, and YouTube will actually just take the transcript and time out the words to match the video and create captions that way. If you have a YouTube video, any YouTube video with captions is going to have a transcript as well. YouTube has updated to kind of hide the transcript button, but if you go under, I think, more underneath the video, you can find the transcript. Andre, I'm sorry, I didn't see when you popped in your question. What are those tools in the chat box? Which tools are you mean about? Contrast or something else? Contrast. Let's see. I have here, I've got a list of resources here I'll share in the chat box. So when it comes to contrast, this is actually from a past webinar that I did. I'll go ahead and pop this into the chat box. If you use the wave tool, I'm trying to see if I have one listed here. This is a list of accessibility resources I have from my website in the past webinar that I did. If you use the wave tool from WebAIM, that has a contrast checker. If you also Google accessibility contrast checker, there's a few options that'll come up as well. Okay. Moving on. If you are producing an online experience, it's really important to avoid hyperlinking click here. If you're using a screen reader, the screen reader will read aloud click here instead of, you know, being descriptive about where it's going. All the user will hear is click here. They're not going to know what that link is or where it goes. It's going to feel completely disconnected from the rest of the website. Hyperlink descriptive statements instead, like sign up for an account, latest report, that kind of thing. Well, you see, is that YouTube transcription or pay option or free? It's free. YouTube does free automatic closed captions. The automatic captions are not accurate enough to meet a legal standard for closed captions, but they're getting better and better the more you know, time goes by. YouTube keeps updating that whatever AI is picking out words out of a video. But it is free, and you can always upload your video privately. It'll create the captions. You can correct them in YouTube, and then you can always download your captions as well if you want to be able to use those captions someplace else. I do that a lot. I use YouTube as a tool to create my closed captions, and then I'll just delete the whole video after downloading the caption file, and I can upload my video elsewhere and use that caption file with that video elsewhere, and the captions will work great, and I just use YouTube to create that. All right, something else, if you are using a Microsoft product or a learning management system, it's important to format your documents using headings. I'll show you how to do that in just a second. It adds structure and navigability to your digital documents. So if you are a sighted user of a website, you're probably used to being able to scan through headings and see what you want to read on a page. It's important that you don't just use bold or italics in your online documents, that you actually use the heading feature in your learning management system or in Microsoft, so that on the back end, it's technically formatted for your screen reader users or your keyboard users to be able to go through and scan the document as well. If you're not familiar with headings, it's kind of a little tricky. H1 is actually the biggest and H1 is the smallest. And you'll find this in Microsoft Word under Styles or the Styles pane. I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. And it does help keyboard users navigate your documents as well, not just screen reader users. All right, so I did this really quick video to show where that's, well, this is a screenshot, I mean, of where to find this in Word. This is the Home tab in Word, and this is the Styles pane. You'll see it's labeled Heading 1, Heading 2. As you use these, the other headings will appear. It's important that you use the actual styles rather than just going and changing the font size, because this is a technical formatting of your text that's going to label something as a heading 1, heading 2 in the background where you can't really see the programming going on, but your screen reader users and your keyboard users will be able to better scan your documents if things are formatted this way. If it's just formatted using size or bold, it's just going to be like a wall of text basically for your keyboard and screen reader users. If you're not sure if your online content is accessible, WebAIM has a really wonderful tool called WAVE. It's a web accessibility evaluation tool. On that link I shared, I have a link to WAVE, and I also have a video on how to use WAVE. I also have a practice activity on that page as well if you wanted to practice evaluating accessibility. I have a whole other webinar I do where it's just accessibility, so there's the resources for that. And what's nice about that tool is that it generates a really nice report for you. You just put in whatever web address you want to evaluate. So if you have a lockdown learning management system, you might not be able to use it. There is a plugin for Chrome, though. If you put that onto your Chrome browser, I think you can still evaluate anything that's in a password protected site as well. But it'll generate a really nice report for you where it tells you what the errors are, what the alerts are. It can be kind of a lot to go through. So I do have a video to show you how to do that if you're interested in that. All right. So we're at 5 minutes left. Let's do a quick recap. So I recommend making your learning social. Learners are going to be more motivated and successful when social opportunities exist. It kind of creates a greater connection to the course. I encourage contact between learners and the instructor. I'm sure you're already doing that, but it's also important to encourage contact between learners so they start to feel like they're part of a community and not just isolated. And again, it can feel artificial when you first start teaching online to be really proactive and humanizing your experience by being really proactively empathetic, but kind of start building those habits from the start so it feels more and more natural all the time and it comes more automatically to you. And it's also important to give learners control and choices as well, because it helps them feel like they have greater control over their learning experience. All right, so universal design for learning. Universal design for learning takes kind of traditional educational experiences, which are more one size fits all and constructed for a mythical average learner that doesn't exist. It transforms your learning into something more usable for as many learners as possible. That means offering a variety of formats, both in how they experience the content and also in how they're able to show what they learned, how they're able to express what they learn. You can let your learners choose, and they can choose, just something that makes them feel good, or maybe they can choose something that better fits who they are as learners. Maybe they have a disability or something that one format's better than the other. In any case, it's going to benefit them to have a choice to feel like they have more control over their experience. And lastly, for accessibility, quick recap of the features I recommend. Include closed captions and videos, use alternate text for images, ensure sufficient contrast. When you use hyperlinks, avoid click here, be a little bit more descriptive in what you actually are linking, what text you're linking. And generally, no matter what platform you're using, there's going to be built-in formatting options, either in Microsoft products or in your learning management system or your web editor. It's going to be built-in formatting options, including headings that you should use to make your content technically accessible on the back end where we can't really see it, but it's going to be more useful for your learners that are using assistive technology. All right, so that brings me to the end here. I'm going to find my slides and show